All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I think we're live. Yes, we are. We are live. Good morning, everyone. Both in the virtual world, which I guess you're not in the virtual world, you're in wherever you are at. But, all right, this morning we're going to look at Isaiah and chapter 21 through chapter 23. And we get pretty deep in the Bible class. Excuse me. We get pretty deep in the Bible class, but in the sermon here, I want to stay a little bit more top level, and I want to make more connections for today. So we made a few connections right at the end to today's lesson, but I want to keep your eyes open for the big picture here is what I'm trying to say, because we're in the last two oracles now, or burdens, here in Isaiah chapters. Well, last three oracles, 21, 22, and 23. We've got prophecies concerning Babylon and the various Arabs in Arabia, Kedar and Duma and a few others. And then Jerusalem is grouped in with this group, and Tyre is at the end here. And we're looking at lessons in trust. This has been the main theme here for the first two-thirds of the book, and it will be for the first two-thirds of the book here. Until chapter 39, these are lessons in trust. And so Isaiah is trying to prepare the people for that first lesson of servanthood. So the first lesson of being the servant of God is trusting in the God of Israel. Because if you don't trust in someone, you won't be willing to submit yourself in service to them. If we don't trust God, there's no way that we can be His servants. And so we have to be willing to say, in every situation of our lives, that God, or as it is here in Isaiah, it's translated as Lord in all capitals. That's the word Yahweh. That Yahweh's basic, most fundamental purpose for me, that God's most fundamental purpose for me is good, even when we don't understand what that purpose is for us. That we trust God to do good for me and through me. That's what real trust is. And that only happens if you will believe that. God is God. Sorry. And if you believe that, then and only then will you dare to live your life boldly in His name, right? But if you aren't fully committed, then you will always be hedging your bets, right? We won't rely on God fully. We're gonna take this wisdom, these wise people over here, and we're gonna take their advice instead of what God wants us to do. And they will always fail you, always. Whether that's modern medicine, right? I'm not telling you not to go to the doctor. That's not what I'm saying. But if you think the doctor's going to keep you alive forever, ain't happening. Or if you think the national government is going to keep you safe forever, not happening. Not happening. Because those are man-made structures. They are eventually going to fail. So Isaiah is going to say a very particular thing now, and that is that we should not trust in the human nations, especially the human nations here that we're going to talk about this morning. So this is the last of the series of human nations here. Let's look a little bit over some of the ones we talked about in the past few weeks. So we've already seen in the poetry of chapter 13 and 14, we've seen Babylon called the glory of the nations. The glory of the nations. But the glory of the nations can't even compare to God's glory. Right? Babylon, the glory of the nations, is used as a symbol It's going to be very important. They're used as a symbol of all that is seemingly glorious about these great human power structures. At this point in time, Babylon wasn't even a nation yet. They were still a vassal city, state sort of thing to Assyria. But they eventually would overcome Syria with the help of the Medes and the Persians. But what does that glory amount to? What is that glory of the nations? What does that amount to? Isaiah says it amounts to nothing. What is the pride of the nations? Right? Moab, chapters 15 and 16, the pride of the nations. What does that amount to? Nothing. What is your northern neighbors, Assyria and Israel, and even to the south, Cush and Ethiopia? What are those political scheming and those alliances? What do those things amount to? Isaiah says zero. They amount to nothing. What do the religions and great wisdom of, and by this time, do you realize by the time Abraham goes to Egypt for the first time, 1,500 years before we're talking about here in Isaiah, that the pyramids were already almost 1,000 years old by the time Abraham goes there? There was this great amount of quote-unquote wisdom in Egypt because they had these great religious man, my mind just went blank. They have these great religious traditions that they've held for thousands of years. Great medical resources were there. They were very advanced in the medical world. They were doing surgery. And what does Isaiah say that wisdom and their religions and their wise men, what does that amount to? He says they couldn't even predict when the God of Israel took the Israelites out the first time. He said it's nothing. It amounts to nothing. What is the commerce of the nations, right? That's what Babylon stands for. Chapters 21 and 22 with Babylon and Jerusalem. What is the commerce of the nations? This great wealthy nation that becomes the archetype that John the Revelator uses when he writes Revelation. What does the great harlot eventually amount to? Nothing, because she falls. So this is the story of what has been happening here since chapter 13. Now we're going to continue it on through these nations here that I listed earlier, through chapter 23. So let's get into chapter 21. And this lesson's, I'm just going to warn you this morning, this lesson's going to be a little bit short because of the whole baby thing this week. I didn't have a lot of time to prepare it, but we'll see if we can get out of here before noon maybe. It'll be my shortest lesson in a long time. Let's look at Babylon and how they're used in chapter 21, or how Isaiah uses Babylon in chapter 21. Chapter 21, verse 1, the oracle concerning the wilderness of the sea. The windstorms in the Negev sweep on. It comes from the wilderness, from a terrifying land. A harsh vision has been shown to me. The Negev is actually south of Israel. And the nations that were south of Israel, especially in the Arab Peninsula, Arabian Peninsula, allied with Babylon to defeat Assyria. And we've already read about Babylon previously in chapter 13 and 14. And he talks about their downfall, and he says it's like the stars falling from the sky. What does that mean to you when the stars fall from the sky? If you looked out and saw the stars falling, what would you think? That's the end of the world type of stuff. That's how Isaiah is saying this is the fall of Babylon is going to be. It's going to be bad. Stars are falling from heaven. The mountains are shaking. And there's fire. This is really scary, end of the world type stuff, right? But he's talking about the downfall of a nation. Then in that poem there in chapter 13, he says it clear as day, that he's actually talking about the downfall of Babylon. He's talking about the downfall of Babylon to their allies, the ones that helped them take over Assyria, to the Medes and the Persians. The Persians are the Elamites. We studied that in class. But Isaiah is using poetic imagery here, and he's using figurative language that describes what would have been the end of the world to these people, right? That's the kind of thing that prophets do, right? This is what Jesus does when he predicts the fall of Jerusalem in the Gospels. We studied that in Matthew, right? Chapter 24, 25. He actually quotes from Isaiah chapter 13 here when he does that, when he describes the fall of Jerusalem, like the stars falling in the sky. He says that about Jerusalem, but that had already been said 500 years earlier. 700 years earlier by Isaiah. And so Jesus is using Isaiah's poetry to describe the fall of Jerusalem. But he does this using this cataclysmic language, which brings us to chapter 21. We talked about chapter 23. Now we're in 21. You see, the Bible's way of viewing history is different than how we view history for, say, the last 200 years. Ever since the Enlightenment, I don't know if you know about that, if you studied that in your history class, but the rise and fall of the Enlightenment in the last 200 years has meant that we tend to take things over literally. We want to say, well, what stars fell? Which ones were they? Take me on that road, Isaiah, that you're walking down. Well, it's not a road, it's figurative. And so we have difficulty understanding these poetic things. But in the Bible's way of viewing history, it doesn't view it as a series of factual events that happened. I'm not saying there's not facts in the Bible, but that's not how people from before 200 years ago throughout all of human history viewed history. They view things in terms of archetypes. So, in the Bible's way of viewing history, the rise and fall of Egypt and the rise and fall of Babylon then become like glasses. I can put on the Babylon glasses and I can view the future through the lenses of the past. So Babylon becomes an archetype of how God is going to work throughout all of human history, even into the future. And so in Egypt, Yahweh frees his people to live, not just frees them to free them out of oppression, but he frees them to live under his kingdom and under his rule. It wasn't just to get them out from oppression, right? He wants them to come into this relationship with him. And now Babylon, like Egypt, is a large, oppressive, evil empire, this power structure that has exalted itself to the place of God, just like the Egyptian pharaohs did. They were gods to the people. They were worshipped. Babylon then must be humbled. She must be judged for her actions because she is not God. Because when humans view themselves as having the same power as a god, the necessary outcome is oppression. It is always the case that oppression is the outcome of that. Specifically, we've talked about it before, what are the reasons that Israel and Judah are being judged? In the first 5 chapters is Isaiah's introducing this material. The leadership is oppressing the people, specifically the widows, the orphans, and the poor. You'll find those 3, and a 4th one often added is the foreigner or the refugee. When those people, the poorest of the poor, who can't even take care of themselves, when you have a society that specifically takes advantage of those people, God says, I'm not going to allow that to continue forever. I'm going to use a more powerful nation to put an end to it. And so we need to look into our own lives in our own country, in our own time period, and see, are we taking care of the widows, the orphans, the poor, the foreigner? Are we doing those things? It's not limited to those, right? It's not like only those, we can only help those, but not all the rest. No. The point is that we need to have a just society that doesn't take advantage of people, that doesn't put a little finger on the scale when nobody's looking to gain a little bit extra, right? So in Egypt, Yahweh frees his people to live under his rule, and now Babylon, who has become this large, oppressive power structure, this evil empire that has exalted itself to the place of God, Babylon must be humbled and has to be judged for her actions. And when she is, the oppressed, the captives that were taken away, will be freed. But this archetype that I'm talking about here doesn't begin with Babylon. It doesn't begin with Assyria. It begins, like we talked about in the class, in Genesis 11. Genesis 11 is about, in our English Bibles, this tower in Babel. Doesn't sound, I mean, it might be related. Are they related? Yes, it's the same word for Babylon in Hebrew there that is translated Babel in our Bibles. So Genesis 11 lays the foundation of Babylon as this archetype, as this pair of glasses that we're going to look forward and see the truth of the situation around us. So Babylon, or Babel, the Tower of Babylon, they build this tower. Why do they build this tower? Because they want to become like God. If they say, if we build this thing to heaven, we can just go to heaven and not have to live here on the earth. We can be like God. But Babylon is also where Israel is going to end up at the end of this long storyline, this narrative arc that stretches to the end of the book of Isaiah. Right? Let's jump back in time, though, to Genesis, because we have this foundation of Babel, this tower of Babylon, but the next chapter jumps ahead, and in the next chapter, Genesis chapter 12, we have Abraham, who is called out of the scattering from Babel, right? Tower of Babel, everybody's scattered. Where does Abraham come from? He comes from the east, from the area of Babylon. And he comes west. Give me one second. So Abraham is going to get called out of that scattering of Babylon in the next chapter, in Genesis chapter 12. And then his family is going to end up eventually back in exile. Where? In Babylon. Because Babylon destroyed Jerusalem and took its people captive. So Babylon is both at the beginning of the story, because Israel wasn't Israel until Abraham's grandson or great-grandson and their children, right? So Babylon is at both the beginning and the ending of this big biblical story of Israel. And in the Hebrew scriptures, at both ends of the story. And at both ends of the story, it represents rebellion at a collective civilization level. Babel, the whole civilization comes together to build this tower collectively. Babylon, the empire, then comes up and rises up. The king thinks he's a god. And an entire population of people becomes arrogant and, more importantly, corrupt. And at the Tower of at the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babel is not the last time that Babylon will exalt itself to divine status. Right? That's going to be an important motif throughout all of the Hebrew scriptures here in the Old Testament, especially to the prophets. The prophets are going to call out people who become arrogant, they're going to use the lenses of Babylon, the Tower of Babylon, to do that with. And then after they go into captivity, in Ezekiel, he's going to use the lenses of not just the tower now, but his own captivity in Babylon to tell the future of the people in terms of the arrogance that they had in Jerusalem. And so how does this tie in? We studied 2 or 3 weeks ago, we studied this term, the day of the Lord. Many other prophets, most notably for us, it would be Jesus and John the Revelator from Revelation. They use Babylon as a way to describe what God's going to do to this whole world, to the whole world order and the power structures in it. This is what God is going to do. He's going to do the same thing that he did to the Tower of Babel. He's going to do the same thing that he did to Babylon, the empire. He's going to rescue all of his people that are oppressed. That's what the day of the Lord is, right? When we are rescued, we can say we're part of the people of the Lord because we have been brought into the family, right, through Christ. But for Jews and Judah, the day of the Lord, they felt like that happened when Cyrus sent back the captives from Babylon. But they knew that this wasn't a complete because all of Israel wasn't brought back. Archaeological estimates estimate about 30,000 people came back and rebuilt the temple. That's not very many people, folks, who come back from captivity. That's not the hundreds of thousands that were carried off into captivity. But the day of the Lord in the scriptures also is in reference to the end of the world. And so in the book of Revelation, the day of the Lord is described as the fall of Babylon, the great prostitute. And we talked about this a little bit in class, but I want to get a little bit more into it now. And I realize that if this is the first time you've come, this is like super dense. But we've been preparing for this for like 6 or 8 weeks, so just kind of hang tight with me. And if you have any questions, we can talk about it afterwards. Because I promise I'm not an end-of-the-world preach on Revelation every Sunday type of guy. This just happens to be where we're at. So the day of the Lord is also kind of a figure, a representative of the end of the world. So in the book of Revelation, Babylon, the great prostitute, is kind of described as Babylon falling. This woman, let me just turn there real quick so I quit stumbling. Revelation chapter 17. Babylon is first introduced there in chapter 16. And then this is the seventh bowl of wrath that, this is where we're at in the bigger picture of things, is the seventh bowl of wrath that's being poured out. And then the metaphor is extended into 17 and 18, is the seventh bowl of wrath is the great Babylon, the great prostitute Babylon, the city prostitute who is falling, who's being judged. So, chapter 17 in verse 18. Let's start in verse 17. Revelation 17:17. For God has put in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God should be fulfilled. And the woman whom you saw is the great city. Remember, this is John writing in the first century. He's not talking about ancient Babylon, because ancient Babylon was, by this point, had been destroyed 3 times and was nothing but a goat herding area. And the woman whom you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. I wonder what great city rules over the kings of the earth during John's lifetime. I wonder. Sounds a lot like Rome. So, This great city that John is talking about here most likely is Rome, but he's using the lenses of Babylon to look at this. So now, this city/woman is a powerful nation, but it's also an archetype, right? A symbol that is going to be carried forward into the future for us. So now John is going to use Babylon to view Rome, but he's viewing Rome so that we can view Rome in our own day in the 22nd century. 21st century. Getting ahead of myself. So let's see if we can apply this to us today. Let's try and make this relevant for us today. In Revelation chapter 18, the very next chapter, John hears an angel quoting from Isaiah 21, what we're studying today. And the angel says in verse 9, "And the kings of the earth who committed," my eyeballs, "and the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality and live sensuously with her, and weep and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning." In verse 9 here, not verse 9. In Revelation 18 in verse 2, quotes 21 in verse 9. And he says, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, and she has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every unclean spirit." Now is the judgment that takes the life of this infamous prostitute from chapter 17 that we saw. So Rome had become the center of power, of luxury, of fierce opposition against the Christian faith. And all the nations had come to Rome and drunk of her adulterous wine, right? Kings committed adultery with her. They did bad things for Rome so that they could become rich. Merchants grew rich from her excessive luxuries. And all I'm doing is quoting here from verse 3. "And the nations have drunk the wine of passion from her immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her. And the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality." What does that word mean? Or luxury. One of the problems here is that the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her luxury. How did Rome become rich? They went and conquered people. They went and oppressed them. They killed you if you didn't agree with them or pay them tribute. And other nations got in on the act and said, "Oh, well, we'll ally with you if you'll give us some of that money, that blood money that you're extracting from other people." And so then in chapter 18 here, another angel comes and calls God's people out of that city. He says, "Come out of her." Verse 4, "And I heard another voice from heaven saying, 'Come out of her, my people, come out of Babylon, that you may not participate in her sins, and that you may not receive of her plagues.'" What are some of these sins, though? What are we supposed to come out of and not participate in? Remember, we got the lenses of Babylon on. What did Babylon do? What did the Tower of Babel represent? Represents arrogance, believing in yourself over God. And so we have this fallen is the Babylon, but Babylon glorified herself, and she lives in luxury. In verse 7 it says, "I sit as a queen. I am no widow. Mourning I shall never see." Does that sound familiar? How about our own country in belief that in American exceptionalism, I'm no widow as a country. We're the great U.S. We're never going to see mourning because we have a strong army, because we have these alliances with people, right? That's arrogance, God says. And that's not just the U.S., it's every country. All nations like to think that they're going to last forever, right? But Unfortunately, the United States has this penchant. I like using that word. They have this penchant for using Bible verses to justify our own arrogance. And in particular, presidents seem to do this. And I mentioned this in the Bible class, and I'm just using this one because it's the most recent one. In fact, the previous president probably made many more grievous references to the Bible than this one has, but give this one time too. A few days ago, our president quoted from Isaiah chapter 6. He said that the U.S. military would answer the call of, "Here I am, send me." Why was Isaiah told? Why did Isaiah say, "Here I am, Lord, send me"? What was the message he was told to go tell everybody when he was sent? It was death and destruction. The destruction of the powers, not the powerful leading to the destruction of others. And so, unfortunately, we've conflated, we have mixed up foreign policy with religious calling in our country. And that's a recurring tendency throughout American history. It's also a very dangerous one because it transforms this risk-benefit analysis that we're trying to make in these situations. It transfers that from just being risk-benefit into contests between good and evil. And you're never evil, right? I'm on God's side. I'm the good one. Those other people, they're evil. And so our president, like so many other presidents before him, need to remember that presidents are not prophets, first of all, and that the U.S. military is not the army of God. And to think otherwise is to be Babylon, is to be in extreme arrogance, to believe that you are the right hand of God going and executing his ideals militarily. That is just not in the Bible. Let me just tell you that. All right, let me get off my high horse there, and let's get back to Isaiah chapter 22 now. So Isaiah says all these things about Babylon, and turns out Judah is in the same boat. So what is Isaiah saying by including Judah in this list with all these other nations? He's saying, don't even trust in yourself. You aren't different than these other nations, right? Isaiah says that you should not trust some national entity to save you. Does this sound counter to any other political messages that we've heard, especially during election season? What do we hear? You need to elect my party, right? Because he's going to save the country. And in fact, that was a literal quote from a presidential candidate in the last election. The last political election was framed. It was framed in religious good versus the evil of this other over here. Let's read chapter 21 and verse 1. The oracle concerning the wilderness of the sea. Chapter 22, not 21. The oracle concerning the valley of vision. How far can you see in a valley? You can't see over the mountain, that's for sure. This is an oxymoron. Isaiah is saying you can't even see anything. You are stuck in your own arrogance here. The valley of vision, this oxymoron, it's not a mountain of vision. You get up on the mountain, you can see everything. But this is a valley of short-sightedness, Isaiah is saying. So how is Judah and us today, how are we supposed to view this final day of the Lord at the end of time? What is our attitude supposed to be? And the answer is the same answer throughout all of Isaiah from chapter 1 to chapter 39, and that is trust. Trust in the Lord. Trust in the Lord and you will find joy. Notice I didn't say happiness, though. Joy in the comfort of knowing the one who is in control. But this isn't a giddy type of joy, is it, right? We don't plan parties when the world is crumbling around us. Some people do, right? Eat, drink, and be merry. That's from the verse here. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That's not a delusional joy. What we have in God is a confidence in Him and what He does in our lives and in His final victory in the final day of the Lord. You see, God doesn't want us to destroy ourselves. Chapter 22 and verse 4. Therefore I say to you, turn your eyes away from me. Let me weep bitterly. Do not try to comfort me concerning the destruction of the daughter of my people. Of course, this is language taken right out of chapters 1 and 2 when he talks about his daughter being Zion. He's weeping over the destruction of his daughter. He doesn't want her to come to this. He wants her to trust in him, and he will protect them. Not trust in the nations, not trust in political alliances, not trust in presidents or kings or anybody else. He wants them to trust in him. And so he says, in chapter 22 and verse 11, he says, let me back up. And you saw in verse 9, 22 and verse 9, and he saw that the breaches in the wall in the city of David were many, and you collected the waters of the lower pool. These are all things Hezekiah did. He got the water supply of the city ready because he knew that the Assyrians were coming. He fixed the breaches in the wall. Then you counted the houses of Jerusalem, and he tore down the houses to fortify the wall. So he tore down the houses that were right next to the wall because that would impede progress for the armies. Then he used that rubble to backfill the wall to make it even stronger. You can read all that in 2 Kings if you want to. And then verse 11, and you made a reservoir between the two walls for waters of the old pool. So you made all these preparations, but what? But you did not depend on him who made it, nor did you take into consideration him who planned it long ago. You did not look to him who did it. He didn't look to God. He was looking to his own preparations. He didn't see God who had planned it long ago. So what does it mean to look to your Maker? As some translations have it there. 22 and verse 11. What does it mean to look to your Maker? What does that look like? Praying, maybe? Or trusting? When you wake up in the morning and you're getting ready to face the world, what does it mean to look to your Maker? It looks like trusting. It looks like asking him for guidance, setting up a way of thinking for the day, devoting yourself wholly, and in both sense, double entente there of the word, wholly with an H and holy with a W. Devoting yourselves wholly to him, allowing him to keep you in his hands, no matter the situation, even when you're staring death in the face in the hospital. I mean, we have members here who are in the hospital doing that right now. You need to look to your Maker with an attitude of saying, Lord, I know you win in the end, but here I am, send me. By living your life, living your life looking to your Maker means being the reflection of God, being the image of God. Yahweh, God, is eternally committed to his promises to his people, to Abraham, to Israel, to David. And that means that God would allow Judah and Israel's national structures to be wiped off the face of the earth so that he could create a remnant who would return to him and be faithful, right? chapter 10 and verse 21 real quick. Let me read that. Now it will come about in that day that the remnant of Israel and those of the house of Jacob who have escaped will never again rely on the one who struck them, but will truly rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. For though you are my people, O Israel, may be like the sand of the sea, only a remnant will return, within them will return. A destruction is determined, overflowing with righteousness. Why were they being punished? Because of unrighteousness, because of stealing from those people who had nothing. That's why, in chapters 1 through 5. This is a hard message. This is not an easy message for us, especially today in our time when we're so blessed. This is a message that is difficult. But do we remember what is happening to the northern kingdom as Isaiah is speaking here in these chapters? In 722 BC, Samaria, under corrupt kings, was hauled off into exile by the Assyrians, never to return. This is the same verdict and the same sentence that was given to Judah by the Lord, by Yahweh here in Isaiah chapter 22. And thankfully, Yahweh, God, is faithful. If he was faithful to punish his people in disobedience, how much more faithful will he be to restore them and bring the blessings of his promise to Abraham, to them, and to the world? Because let's remember, in the midst of all of this doom and gloom that we've been reading here in Isaiah, Isaiah has kept the embers of hope lit. He blows on them just a little bit so we can get a glimpse of the glow. Because God has not lost his love for his covenant people, and he has not abandoned them. There is a shoot from the root, right? Chapter 6. From the root of Jesse, that will lead the nations to live in the new Jerusalem that was promised in chapter 2. That shoot is Jesus the Messiah, and he stands today with his hand outstretched, reaching towards you. And the question is, will you take it? Will you become a new creation? Will you submit to God in a trusting relationship? Will you become that new creation, the image of Yahweh? Will you become unstained by the death and the sin of this world? That's the offer Jesus the Messiah gives to us. And that's the lesson this morning, is that he wants us to take hold of that hand, to let go of trusting the world and take hold of his hand. If you need to make that commitment, we can help you with that today. Whether you need to give up the world and decide to make a change, that's called repentance. If you need to believe in God for the first time, you can do that today. If you need to be washed, have the sins washed away from you, to be cleansed like Isaiah was cleansed, we can help you with that through baptism. Or if you've fallen away and you need to come back, we can help you make that change today. Because God is faithful. And that is both hope and that is despair. And that's the lesson for this morning. Next week we'll look at chapters 24 through 27. Hope to see everybody then. Thanks for joining us this morning, everybody.